Okay. I just want to say up front, all the members of that Elders Council are old except me. So, Ani bojo. Benezi Dijnakas Wajash Doraman Schnabak and Guaro Doramodna Shoni, Alderville Donjibad, North Bay and Diana and Schnabak and down. So the name on my vaccination receipt is Maurice Switzer, and my family roots are in the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation in near Coburg. Actually, Coburg's near us. I guess that's the best way. And I have a couple of clans, and because I have Haudenosaunee as well as Anishinaabe heritage, and so I'm Muskrat Wajash clan and Wolf clan through my great grandmother Esther Hill from Tyendinaga, Mohawk territory. So I'm really pleased to be here. And before we start, Jody, maybe can I just give my pep talk to teachers? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, a few things that I want to say that I always say to teachers. I encounter so much reticence on the part of even the most experienced, capable teachers when they get into this area of talking about Indigenous issues, and part of that is because usually great social change is led by governments and politicians. And this huge social change that some people call reconciliation, the education part of it, is falling on the shoulders of teachers, classroom teachers. And you're leading this huge social change that is really astounding. And it's quite bewildering for a lot of Canadian citizens because they never studied most of the things that we're talking about when they were in school. And that applies to members of parliament, to judges, to lawyers, to journalists, to social workers, to doctors, to lawyers. This is all new. Most of what I'm going to talk about today and what I talk about in treaty sessions, I've learned in the last 25 years of my life because I didn't learn it in school. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by the topic. I don't want anybody to feel inhibited about asking questions. And I know that Jody collected some in advance, which is great. And I encourage you to be as brave about teaching Indigenous topics as you would about teaching trigonometry. I think that's a lot tougher. I don't give advice very much, but I tell teachers two things. Don't be afraid of Indigenous topics. And secondly, don't pretend to know anything you don't know. That's really important. You've got all sorts of resources available out there, and you're lucky that there's an association that Natalka and Tisa and Jody are involved with, and they're available at a keystroke to point you in the right direction. So, we've come from a point, a generation ago where there were no resources and available, and now there's lots. So, and there's still some being developed by this wonderful association that Jody and Natalka are co-chairing. So I just want to say that. The other thing I want to say, and we're not going to talk about it too much today, it might come up, whenever there's any discussion about the negative aspects of Canada's history, whether it's violated treaties or residential schools, it's not your fault. I'm not interested in making anybody feel guilty or blaming anybody. My role as an educator is to share information that I hope will contribute to making Canada a better place for everybody, including Indigenous peoples, in the next 150 years than it was in the first 150. So that's my sole motivation, not to make anybody feel bad. So anyways, those are things I wanted to say, and I'm glad to be here and appreciate everybody who's taken the time, and my colleagues, I appreciate you being here as well. They carry a lot of knowledge with. So miigwech, thanks.
Miigwech, Maurice. So I'm going to share the treaty education guidelines that we have recently put out, and maybe Maurice, there's I'm gonna just, or Tisa or Natelka, just putting you on the spot. If there's anything that you would like to specifically speak to, maybe in this opening slide here, just these are some key, like big ideas around what we want to try and bring forward in education for treaty education.
Well, can I start?
Absolutely.
Okay. One of the questions that you collected from teachers who took the time to send them in was, what are the most important enduring understandings that students should walk away with in elementary school? That's sort of big ideas to me. And they're sort of included in here. I'll go through them. Treaties are legal agreements. The difference between Indian treaties, and I'm going to use that word historically because most of the treaties were historic. The difference between most treaties in the world, and there are, you know, nuclear disarmament treaties, environmental treaties, trading treaties. One of the differences is that Indian treaties had a sacred element to them. That's very important. They were sacred ceremonial events, which makes the violation of them even more serious than if it's just a legal contract. So that's something that we have to remember. Treaty making preceded North American settlement. Yes, Indigenous peoples, First Nations made agreements among themselves. You know, that's a fact, and there are records of that. They had to get along, you know, because they weren't all the same. That's one of the myths, is that all, you know, Indigenous peoples are the same. They're very different. There are hundreds of nations across Turtle Island, North America. Treaty outlines the terms, relationship, and conditions of settlement. Yes, the treaties from the Indigenous perspective was, you know, we were asked to make treaties by newcomers. They wanted to share our land, and that was what the treaty process was supposed to be about. It evolved into something a bit less respectful as the years went by, and as the settler population started to outnumber the Indigenous population. But it's important to remember that Indian treaties only recognized Indigenous rights that already existed. They did not give Indigenous peoples any rights. We have inherent rights, as do all peoples in the world, as particularly First Peoples. We have the right to manage our own affairs, to govern ourselves, you know, to look after our lands. Nobody came from anywhere else and gave us any rights. They were fortunate enough that our ancestors agreed to share the use of the land and its resources with them. The next point, both settler and Indigenous nations have a responsibility for knowing and upholding the treaty obligations. If you remember one thing that you hear come out of my mouth today, remember this: we are all treaty people. I know that there's some even individual First Nations that say, "Oh, we never, our ancestors never really agreed to a specific treaty." My position is that on the terms of the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara the year after in 1764, recognized that the, quote, Indian tribes of North America are nations. I don't think that anybody in any First Nation in Canada would want to give that away, because whether they were there or not, that's a pretty good recognition by the mightiest European empire in history. So, so we all have rights. We all have responsibilities. Indigenous peoples have feel that we still don't have our rights recognized because non-Indigenous peoples haven't lived up to their responsibilities in the sharing that was called for. And the last point, treaties are legally binding documents. It's not just Indigenous peoples that say so. Canadians need to look no further than their own constitution, section 35, that says that the treaty and Aboriginal rights of Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. This past July, the government of Canada thought treaty rights were so important that they included them for the first time in the citizenship oath. Every new citizen that comes to this country now has to not just swear allegiance to the reigning monarch of the Commonwealth and to uphold the laws of Canada, they have to uphold the treaties. And it's kind of ironic that the government that's asking all the new immigrants to uphold treaty rights is the same government that has violated them all, but that's a very complicated issue. So they are legally binding. They are not a figment of anybody's imagination, and they do not expire. That's the other important thing to remember. The treaties that were enacted 250 years ago are still enforced today because the people who asked us to make agreements with them promised that they would last as long as the sun rises in the east. So if that doesn't happen tomorrow morning, hey, I'm not worried about treaty rights. That's going to be the least of my concern. But as long as that sun comes up, those treaties are alive, no expiry date. So that's my take on those bullet points. So go ahead.
Tisa, do you want to add in?
Yeah, thanks, Maurice. I also I want to encourage educators also to to really take to heart what Maurice is sharing, and also to transfer those lessons and that thinking to all subject areas and all weeks of the school year. Like this treaty recognition, treaty honoring, it is absolutely, a highlight of the first week in November, but it's highlighted during the first week in November, but we are treaty partners all year round. And it isn't a unit of study. It isn't your heritage and identity unit in social studies. It is beyond that. And it should be incorporated into, it could be incorporated into many subject areas at any time of the year. Hey, Gretch.
Natalka, anything you want to add on?
I was just going to speak about just going back to the sacredness of treaties and the fact that, for Indigenous people, but my understanding is we are sacred beings, we're sacred spirits, and when we bring the Creator is our witness to all our diplomacy that we do. And so I think that's a really important aspect of our treaties, that we didn't do anything without Mother Nature, and that was a really important aspect of our diplomacy. The other fact too I want to just echo is our nations were building treaties, but when the settlers arrived, they recognized us as nations and they built treaties with us as well. So we just have to remember and teach our students about that history and the importance of it. I think that's all I want to add.
Okay, so I don't know if we'll go right through all of it, but we really encourage everyone to this is your opportunity to also continue your own learning. So as Maurice said, there's a lot to this, right? But there's also a lot of resources that are now available for you to start your own learning journey. And, I always recommend to teachers as well, start small, start with something, bring that learning into your classroom, and then, build that in over time. And there's also a difference between your learning and then how that translates into the classroom too, as well. Right. So, and differentiating between that and definitely how that translates. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. What does this look like in an elementary classroom? What does this look like in a secondary classroom? And how we can do that. The other thing in here is that, centering Indigenous voices is really, really important. And again, we provide all these resources for you so that, you don't have to be burdened with knowing content and knowing this history and knowing all these things. There's lots and lots of really great videos out there now that you can use to play in your classroom. And then you can have that conversation alongside with your students. Maurice or anyone want to comment on this?
Yeah, you can speak to, to students of all ages about, about treaties as basically promises. And we're particularly, I think, Catholic schools they tend to place a large emphasis on ethics and teaching students to be good citizens. And I mean, what better lesson is there for a student than the importance of keeping promises, especially sacred promises, let alone legal promises, and thinking of examples of why that's important and how that's important in our society. Those are that doesn't just relate to relations with Indigenous peoples. That relates to everybody. Surely everybody wants to have enjoy a reputation where their word and their promise, is meaningful and truthful to others, and so that's character education that I think is part of this whole discussion about the treaty relationship. And the unfortunate fact is that there are dozens and dozens of examples in Canadian history of these sacred agreements being the Indigenous peoples not being given the true picture of what they were being promised. They were misled, they were lied to, and the reason that so many of these cases end up in court and successful for Indigenous plaintiffs and complainants is because there's no doubt that the manner in which the treaties were evolved was not the honor of the crown is the concept that is used whenever the Canadian government engages in any agreements. That the honor of the crown is at stake, and over again, courts are finding that the crown did not act honorably. And so those are lessons that our students need to understand, that just how important it is to be truthful.
I think too, part of that is helping students understand that treaties are about relationships. And when we say we're all treaty people, we're talking about that shared relationship of caring for that agreement, nurturing that agreement. When our people speak about polishing the belts, they're talking about bringing, reminding us of what that relationship was, and how we need to nurture that in order for those agreements to maintain their integrity. And so, I think, impressing upon that relationship, those sacred relationships that we had, that can go, I think, a long way to help students understand the meaning of our treaties. And fundamentally, without me jumping up and down, this is our history. And it was very intentional that the leaders tried to erase this. So, I'll go back to what Maurice said at the beginning about this is not our fault, but I think as educators, we need to carry this for our country, and we need to make sure that our students will do better in the future.
I want to just highlight this little piece here around, this is a practice that we want to avoid and not do anymore, because I know this is really common in a classroom is, the debating. We don't want to debate colonialism anymore. We're not, so you want to be very mindful, especially anything that is going to ask students to take on an actual role or voice of another person. So, I can't possibly pretend to know what it's like to be Maurice and vice versa, right? And so but certainly I can learn about Maurice and his history and things like that. But, you know, but asking kids to step into those roles can actually create harm. And so we just want to be very mindful about doing things like that. And again, going back to the debating thing, you know, especially because, you know, coming up as well is Louis Riel Day. And I know it is a little bit off topic, but I can't tell you how many classes, you know, we hear every year puts Louis Riel on trial again. You know, we got to think very carefully about the impacts that some of our classroom practices can have on students and what it is that we're trying to actually teach about.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, I've always been opposed to any kind of role playing. I think it's prone to disaster. But there are certain things that are given. Like I'll talk about residential schools. That's a given. Everybody knows that. There's some people at the far end of the spectrum that are still in some kind of denial about it. But most, you know, sound people of sound mind understand those things happen. There's all kinds of evidence, some of it fairly recent. You know, to start debating that as a historic fact is like it would be, and it happens. It would be like Holocaust deniers in Europe. Questioning whether 6 million people died in the Holocaust. I mean, some things we just have to understand, particularly as educators, that hey, these things are past the point of needing to be proven. They're there, you know.
And again, this is just building on, right? So being mindful of the narrative, you know, we've been dealing with a lot of erasure. And so this is an opportunity to correct the misinformation as well that still to this day circulates out there. And that's why when we say like include, work depending on where you are, build those partnerships with your local communities. Who's the treaty partner? If you're in a school board in your territory, in your area, make sure you're looking like that should always be the prime, look for learning about the people in the area that you live in or work in, and then build out from there. And then lastly, learn and then act. So where are some connections to this day? Because there's, if there's all kinds of things you can explore when we talk about current issues, and they all connect back to treaties and broken promises and how, why is it? And again, this is going to range depending on the grade you teach. But especially in secondary, like you can get into some really powerful learning moments. And I come from the secondary panel, so that's my background. And kids they're just like, their energy is so amazing for really getting involved in speaking out against injustices that are going on. So it's an opportunity to really, channel that good energy into making change. So I think we'll go into the questions, some of the questions that have been brought forward. I know, Maurice, you had answered one of them, and we would invite you to also use the chat box as well to bring your questions forward. And I'm just going to go to, where are we at?
I've got another one here, Jody.
Yeah.
And thank you for your questions. How are treaties from 200 years ago affecting communities now? That's one way to to help reinforce the idea that treaties aren't, as even the media sometimes refer to them, ancient agreements. They're still in force right today. They're in our Constitution. They're in effect right today. Whether they're being violated or not, they're still on the record. And Jody has heard me say this many times. From a legal perspective, it's always in your favor to have a broken promise on the record than never have a promise made at all. And so how are they relevant today? That's a really good topic, and that helps students and teachers understand. Well, let's think of the biggest benefit of treaties. Biggest benefit is that Canada exists, because historians agree, and many political leaders have voiced this publicly. If it weren't, for example, for the 10,000 Indigenous warriors defending Canada in the War of 1812, we would probably be part of the United States today. So, you know, that's a pretty good benefit, directly resulting from the Treaty of Niagara about 40 years earlier, where we promised that we would be allies of the British. And so that's a pretty big benefit. If you live in a community, and I'm sure we all do, I live in North Bay, where we have paved roads, healthy drinking water sources, hospitals, schools, hockey rinks. All of those things exist because of the great wealth that was generated from Canadian lands. Unfortunately, the other half of this equation is how are treaties affecting communities? If you look at the First Nation communities and Indigenous peoples, I mentioned earlier, we haven't realized our rights and are being shortchanged of them, you know, constantly. All of the social dysfunction and economic marginalization that exists among Indigenous peoples is directly related, you know, to Canada not living up to its treaty promises before Confederation and after. So that's a really good topic, you know, to ask students how to, you know, from what you find in your texts and what you've researched online and wherever, how do you think treaties have affected Canadians and Indigenous people?
So there's a question here. Well, there's a few questions I think that can be put together, is in terms of what this looks like in primary and in elementary. So I'm going to just share my screen again here. So I put this together for my school board. And basically it's just to show kind of a progression of learning through the grades. And I can put this in the chat box for you as well. But, you know, when we think about primary, you know, these are just our little ones. So it's just basic concepts of sharing, you know, the importance of making a promise, why that's really important. You know, there's opportunities to talk about, you know, connection to land, why we should be thinking about even what our relationship is with the land as well, and our goals and responsibilities to that. And then, you know, and then if those foundational pieces are in there for the primaries, then it's an opportunity to kind of progress into junior and intermediate. But you'll notice on the other side here with intermediate, you know, this is also, I should mention, aligned with the social studies curriculum, is that it's not until really grade 8 that the curriculum is asking you to get into talking about residential schools, and really starting to understand things like the Indian Act. So, you know, we want it to be, you know, learning has to be age appropriate and readiness as well, right? In terms of how we're bringing that in. And you'll notice here, threaded throughout, is that there's always an opportunity to bring in contributions. So, you know, when we talk about, because the story of Canada is based on, you know, land theft and genocide, and, you know, and unpacking that, we don't want to leave a deficit narrative either, right? So it's important that, again, depending on the age and grade, that there's always attention given to the incredible contributions, both past and present, that Indigenous peoples have had on society as a whole. So always threaded throughout there, you know, be thinking about how you can bring in those voices. Is there any comments or questions on this? I'll just show you as well. So this is so you can see kind of here too, like the how this connects into the curriculum, and there's different inquiry prompts that you can think about when you're talking with students in your classroom as well. In this. So again, like a big emphasis is on the importance of sharing, the importance of looking after each other, looking after the land, the importance of community, the importance of working together. And then as we start to get into grade 3 and up, it's an opportunity as well. I always talk about the great erasure through maps, right? So we think about when you show maps in school, do you see the Anishinaabe Nation on the map? Because it's easy to just, when you don't see it, it's easy to think it doesn't exist. And so that's like a real powerful way that nations have been erased. So this is an opportunity in education as well to start to introduce that understanding, is that Canada is not the only entity here. Did anybody else want to talk about that? Oh, sorry, I'm just noticing in the chat box here.
Yeah. I'm just seeing here. Oh, yes. So the grade 3 curriculum, just FYI, it's being rewritten, and right now it's awful. Like it really sets, you know, and I feel badly for teachers too, because particularly in grade 3, because it sets you up in a way. It's really hard to do this in a good way when the curriculum itself is designed in such a way that it's just super problematic. So I'm just looking at, anyway, so what is a good way to explain that all non-Indigenous Canadians are settlers on this land? Well, I'm not actually totally sure about the question. And
I sorry, I don't want to barge in. I think I wonder if I feel like, based on what, you know, on Twitter and everything, I feel like there's parts of the population that maybe get their backs up against the wall when being referred to as settlers. And I think maybe that's maybe what this person is trying to figure out.
I'm wondering if maybe I've misunderstood and I'm misusing the word settlers now, because what I found when I talk to my older students is that they get very confused, because when they hear settlers, they think pioneers. They think, you know, what we used to refer to as pioneers when I was a student. And I thought, and perhaps I'm misusing it, that the word settler meant anybody who had maybe heritage from somewhere else in the world and had come, or our ancestors had come to this land and were not Indigenous to this land. Am I misusing the word? Am I misunderstanding what the word means? Maybe that's why I'm confused.
well, this is why we're here. Let's talk about this. This is really important to talk about. Maurice, do you want to?
Yeah,
talk to that?
That's not a word I use. I often use the word newcomer, frankly, when I talk about other than the first peoples who were here. I find terminology is so important, and I've heard people refer themselves as settlers, and it's almost like a self-deprecation the way it's used at times. And I just like, there are a lot of words in use these days. One of the ones that I have a problem with, for example, is in post-secondary, they're talking about indigenizing the curriculum on the campus. I don't know, there are a lot of words that end in IZE that are not very pleasant. So I just, I'm kind of fussy about it, but yeah, when I talk about historic immigration, I say all these people that came here were refugees. You know, I don't call them settlers, I call them refugees, because they were escaping, you know, all sorts of lack of free speech, they lived like slaves, most of them in Europe. But on a contemporary basis, that started to become a word that I don't think Indigenous peoples, well, I shouldn't speak for other Indigenous peoples, it's not a word I use. And I think it's more often used by non-Indigenous peoples, you know, than it is by Indigenous, but it's not a word I use.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the big idea here is that there are original people from the lands, the first peoples, the original peoples, and then there are those who have come to those lands from other places. Like that's kind of like the big, that's what we're trying to I think impart here in the bigger ideas of this, and that the original peoples of this land, you know, come from distinct and very diverse nations that span all across North America, or maybe you've heard, you know, oftentimes is referred to as Turtle Island. And that, you know, there's these nations that have always existed and are still existing today is the other big thing that I think is important that kids are learning about. And that because of the relationship between the original peoples and the nations and the people who are coming over and still coming over to this day, that those the agreements that were made are still valid today, and those agreements outline how we're all to be living together respectfully, where we're mutually benefiting from the lands, because these are all the things that aren't happening today, right? Like, so there's Canada breaks its laws every single day. You know, even when we think about how do these disputes get taken up, of course, this is way out of primary land right now, but you know, how do these disputes get taken up? Think about it. If you're a nation that has a dispute with Canada, why is it that the disputes have to go to Canada's court system? Isn't that a little bit of a conflict? You're taking the abuser to the abuser's court system, but yet even still, even though that's happening, even Canada's own Supreme Court still is ruling in favor of, you know, of Indigenous nations, and when these grievances are brought forward, you know. So I think kind of just going back again is that, like, to focus on those big ideas that we want kids to learn about, you know, is that there's a relationship here, that we're all in a relationship, and we all have roles and responsibilities to ensure a different future than what we're currently in right now. Maurice or Natalka, do you want to add to that?
I was just going to add that, our country, North America, Turtle Island, is based on immigration, you know, and I think that's an important message our students need to hear, because I think that's the big fallacy, that there are people that were, you know, there are generations that were just here. No, this nation, that like our country is founded on immigration. And when people arrived at our shores, we welcome them with open arms, because we have such a great love and appreciation for life and creation. And so how could we go against what we believe in, you know, and destroy human beings that the Creator made? So I think, like, so part of this treaty history we do, I feel like we kind of skip over that whole piece of that mutual respect, that building of relationships between one another. Like, the treaty relationship goes sour as soon as this country becomes imperial, the colonization of the economy, that's when these things start to sour, and that these European nations start to come and take over and deny, I think, Indigenous nations their rights and silence them right at the table. So I think immigration is a huge aspect of our history. And I also think that, they need to understand that without our nations welcoming them, like, we could have a very different kind of history here. So I think, like, yeah, immigration is a huge part of it. And just reminding, I think, students, treaties are not a piece of paper, right? Like, a treaty is really about that agreement between two hearts. And I think maybe that's why there's symbols of human beings with different hearts in them, to show that, that's a very big part of our being. And it goes back to what Maurice said, like, it helps you keep that promise, right? So there's the hearts and the, it reminds you of that, we, amongst our differences, that, human beings, we are spiritual beings, and that, that's what connects us and helps us get along.
There's a question in here that I think kind of flows nicely into what we're talking about. Asking to elaborate on the dish with one spoon treaty. Maurice, do you want to talk a little bit about that? You're on mute.
Thanks.
The
Thank you.
famous Zoom words.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a perfect example of a couple things, not the least of which is the fact that our nations were making agreements among themselves. We didn't need Europeans to come here and say, this is a treaty, like, we didn't learn much in a positive way from Europeans. We had treaty making, and the dish with one spoon was an example because, again, as Natalka just mentioned, when the Europeans brought capitalism to our shores, all of a sudden, there were more arguments and fights about things like beaver hats than had ever existed. They introduced capitalism and competition to our people. And so for the better part of the 17th century, Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee people did a lot of fighting. And one of the agreements that brought that to an end was the dish with one spoon, that basically said, there's enough game, there's enough food in our territories for all of us to share. That belt that has been used for other purposes since. It's been exchanged with settlers, with newcomers, with immigrants, with Canadians, governments, colonizers, and Indigenous peoples to have similar meanings. It's about, and Natalka talked about, the important thing is the relationship, and it's supposed to be a sharing relationship. And so that's what that belt speaks to, is the importance of sharing all that we have here. I've heard people interpret that. There's a lot of wishful thinking, and I think a lot of people, have tried to make some of these agreements into, well, for example, environmental pacts or whatnot. I think it's fair to say that when we made treaties with the Europeans, when we welcomed them, when we developed relationships, our ancestors never in their wildest dreams thought that there would be the kind of environmental damage that ended up happening. When they said part of the agreements were, we want to continue to live in the way we always have, well, they meant, the relationship with the land, obviously. So I think that that dish with one spoon it's a model. I've seen it used by political organizations as justification for You could say it's the first intergovernmental harvesting treaty. You know, we used it when I worked for the Union of Ontario Indians. We showed that to the province with whom we were always fighting about jurisdiction and hunting and fishing rights. And we said, hey, this going back a couple of 100 years says, you know, that there was an agreement that we can share all of the game, the natural resources in our territories. So it's a good belt, but and again, the important thing about it is that was introduced before Europeans got it.
Yeah, treaty making is a contribution to the world.
And I think too, like, I tell students that the Europeans learned our diplomacy, right? When they came to this country, they learned how our people were so diplomatic and how important that was to have good agreements and have good understanding with one another. So I kind of take it on a different approach there. Like, I think they learned treaty making from us. And we can certainly see that in the Treaty of Niagara, when you know, the British adopted our forms of agreement. What else was like something? Oh, about the dish and one spoon. I heard some a woman from the Iroquois Nation speak about that belt at a food sovereignty conference, and she spoke about the belt talking. She says part of that agreement is that we are to use the resources of the land. She didn't say rape the land. She didn't say, you know, like clear cut and take everything you can. She said we are to use the resources so that Mother Earth knows that we are that we need those things from her. And so as long as we use them in a good way, she will provide them in a good way. And I feel like that's stuck with me. Only because like my elder has, that's what she said to me, is that if you want something to grow in your territory, then you need to use it. And so as long as you're using it, Mother Earth will make sure that it's there for you to use.
I think that actually segues into another question that's been brought forward that's tied into a previous question. I'm going to try and group them all together here. Is kind of like, you know, when we talk about our roles and responsibilities with the lands and how we're accessing and utilizing resources, you know, talking about, you know, prior to Europeans coming to these lands, that, you know, our conduct here was based on sustainability, right? Like not taking to the point of our own destruction, like living in a way so that our future generations could thrive. And this has been, you know, this is something that Indigenous peoples from everywhere practice. And if you think about it, everyone is Indigenous to some place, you know. So if we think like colonization is, these lands here are the last kind of to experience violent colonization, you know. And so kind of moving into this next question, which is around, you know, how do treaties and the numbered treaties fit in with the Indian Act? And then if we think about kind of some things happening today currently, and again, this is when we get into these conversations, this is the progression of learning. You know, we're talking about when we start to talk about the change in the agreements, the breaking of promises, the moving into extraction, the whole, you know, motivation behind Canada, the Crown, and then Canada, you know, violently displacing people off of their homelands for the purpose of resource extraction to fuel the almighty dollar, right? Like, so our economy today is all based on the resources that are extracted, that are generating trillions for, you know, just a few people. And now today we are faced with abrupt climate change as a result of it. But I'm thinking maybe Maurice, you know, if you do want to comment a little bit about, because, you know, the Indian Act in grade 8 comes in grade 8 and certainly is definitely a topic into secondary schools, and why it's important to talk about this. Because when we get into the numbered treaties, you know, that's really when things start to change from the original agreements of peace and friendship to just trickery and fraudulent,
Yeah,
lost the wording there, but anyway, you know what I mean?
yeah, it's what the law calls sharp dealing. Things really started to change within 20 or 30 years after the War of 1812. That's when things really started to change, really before the treaties started to progress out west. And most of the treaties, of course, were enacted before the Indian Act in 1876, most of them. And they went across the country, as did settlers. and they the I try to say things in a way that doesn't make everybody feel guilty and bad, but there were so many bad things happen. I was reading an article today about the history of United States residential schools, and the first quote that I saw was from one of the Indian agents who was the head commissioner at Phoenix Indian School, one of the early residential schools. And he said, and this is what he said at the school opening: "It's cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them." You have to understand that that was a mentality at the highest political levels in this country, right into the House of Commons, right into the Prime Minister's office. And to get Indigenous peoples as the numbered treaty process started out west, I mean, there are letters, there is evidence that the first Prime Minister of Canada said, we've got to starve the Indians to get them off their land and onto reserves. And it's when people get really upset about using words like genocide, they haven't really done enough homework. The treaty process was, I tell teachers and students, the treaty process, the relationship was good as long as the newcomers were outnumbered. And after the threat of war disappeared, after the Indigenous warriors had defended what was the center of the continent, Canada, immigration started in full force. And whereas before, when the War of 1812 started, maybe in what we call Ontario, there might have been 10, 15,000 Europeans. By 1850, there were a million. A million. I mean, it was just phenomenal, exponential growth. And that, more than anything, just caused huge dysfunction of Indigenous communities being outnumbered, if you went out to feed your family and hunt and fish, you could be shot at by a farmer. I mean, in my community, Alderville, there are records of that happening in the 1800s. Land that they had been told by the treaty commissioners, you'd always be able to hunt and fish, as you always have. But that word didn't filter down to the settlers. But the treaty process became a tool when that immigration grew exponentially. It became a tool to clear land for settlement. And there are ads out there that the Canadian Pacific Railway, that everybody takes great pride in, they were running ads, posters that encourage people to take the train, come out west. There's going to be free land for you. It wasn't free; it was Indian land. And but that's what happened. And the treaty process became a very cynical tool to get land away from Indians. And if you look at the text of those treaties, the other thing I show students, the Indians couldn't read English in almost every case. They couldn't write their names, but they took the word of the interpreters, who often conveniently left out things. And this happened right across Canada. It happened in the James Bay Treaty, Treaty 9 in 1905, where what was said the treaty contained was not what turned out to be in the written version. And that's like giving someone a blank check and letting them, put in what they want and having that be legal. So yeah, the treaty process at Niagara, that first major gathering, everything was positive on the surface, because at that meeting, there were 3,000 Indian chiefs and about 50 white men. So yeah, it's a good time to be humble. But that relationship, the balance of power, changed with the population demographic change, and again, unfortunately, the treaties became just a tool.
So that
Morris, I was gonna.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was
Natasha.
just gonna add that in the beginning of the treaty process in Ontario, it went amicable because the white people needed the Indians, right?
Yeah.
Like they needed our support in order to maintain their border. So up until 1836 and the Canadian Rebellion, right? All during that period, treaties were kind of a positive thing. Our people were treated fairly well. And then after the rebellion and all that subsided, that's when immigration increases, encroachment increases, and then the government says we can't stop the people from coming. When they look across the river and they see like all this beautiful land, sure, they set up their farms. And then by 1876, when finally Canada is formed and they implement the Indian Act, at that time, many of our leaders in Southern Ontario were petitioning the government against that act. And a lot of laws were made against women. And our chiefs were protesting the government to say that was not right. And then something happens, like within 50 years where that idea gets lost, where our women are important. But after 1876 and the formation of Canada, then it is all about, those treaties are huge. They're taking huge tracts of land. Many nations are included in those treaties, and it really is. They thought we would die out, and so the intention was starve them out, and just get that railroad through, because they were worried the Americans were going to come up and encroach on that land.
Thanks, Natalka, for mentioning the women's situation, because one thing also you should know about treaties, if you look at historic paintings or etchings of treaty gatherings, you won't see any women there. And the Europeans brought many things on their boats. One of them was capitalism, one of them was misogyny. And they instructed chiefs not to bring women to treaty gatherings. They wouldn't deal with them. And that's part of the Eurocentric. When you talk about worldviews, women played a huge role in Indigenous societies, a huge role, and that was not part of the European mindset. And it was, it's significant. I think women got to vote in Canadian federal elections about 1925, somewhere around there, late 20s. Indians didn't get to vote until 1960, I don't think. But to vote, you have to be a person.
And you know what? I think even women got the vote, like the Native women got the vote even later than the men.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
But let's go on that note. What do you mean by you have to be a person? Because this leads into the Indian Act.
Yes, that's the definition. Is that only a person has a right to cast a ballot in the British parliamentary system in our democracies. So that means that women. That means that Indians were not persons and women were not persons in the eyes of the law of Canada.
And that's important, because if you think about the goals of imperialism and colonialism, is that if you're not a person, then you can be subjugated and treated as like property and all of those things. And
someone needs to take care of you because you're not able to take care of yourself.
Yes.
And that is huge in the Indian Act, because outlawing women's right to have status depending on whoever they married. like, I feel like that was that mentality. Oh, well, if you marry a white man, well, he can look after you. So then you're not our responsibility anymore. But if you marry a native man, then I guess we have to look after you because he can't look after you. Certainly not, right? Like, absolutely, misogyny was huge. I tell kids too a lot about the whole feminist movement. You know, Nellie McClung was she was a racist.
Yeah.
And you know, she wanted to sterilize all of us Native women.
Yeah.
And I remember my first child, he's 28 now, but I was way up north and I was afraid because I'd heard stories from my colleagues in school that if depending on what hospital you went, you could come out sterilized. And that's 1993, right? So that belief or even that behavior was still going on at that time. Yeah, get all heated up.
And still is today. And
Yes.
still is today. Forced
Yes.
sterilization is still happening today. And, you know, the other thing too is like many people don't realize that the Indian Act, which it's still on the books, people, inspired, you know, World War II and the Holocaust. Like, look at the cards. Like, they came here and studied the effectiveness of the Indian Act. Same with the apartheid system in South Africa. Came here and studied the effectiveness of the Indian Act. Now, those two things are no longer in existence, but yet Canada still got an Indian Act on the books. Still legally, you know, what would happen if, you know, we Canada enacted like the Muslim Act tomorrow? What might happen? Hopefully there might be an outrage. Hopefully there might be like people freaking out and, you know, going crazy over the insidiousness of that. But yet nobody blinks an eye that we have an Indian Act here. Like that always, I'm like, wow, no, so no one really, so, you know, this is why education is so powerful and so important, because the more that we are bringing these forward into schools and classrooms, again, age appropriate, the kids today are going to grow into adults that are going to be much different in how they think and how decisions are going to be made. And that's, you know, I think what Maurice was saying at the very beginning, right? Don't wait for the government to do the right thing. That's like waiting for the curriculum to get fixed. It's us on the ground. It's the teachers that are going to we have the ability to create the most enormous systematic change in society. It's just that I think, you know, it's hard for us as educators because we don't get to see those changes immediately, right? But I can tell you because, you know, that from the time I was in the classroom, I still talk with kids, you know, just by bringing them out, you know, we would do these culture camps and stuff like that. And it drastically changed their lives. Some kids went on and changed their whole degrees that they went into because of these experiences that they're having in the classroom. And you don't have to know all the answers to do this work and learning. Going on an inquiry learning journey with students is powerful learning. It takes you out of being the expert in the classroom. It is very empowering to tell students, I actually don't know the answer to this question, but you know what? I want to try and find out. Let's find out together. You know, when you become vulnerable in your humility as a human that can't possibly know everything, it actually invites students to be vulnerable and also be courageous in their learning, to see that it's okay to ask questions and not know all the answers, and to come to start to realize like, hey, things are not what we thought about Canada here. What the heck? That's really powerful and necessary to be happening. So, you know, I'm going to move into this question that was submitted because it's kind of related to what we were talking about, this change in the relationship. Things got real bad and are still bad today. And so the question is, why is the recognition of unceded land leading the Attorney General of New Brunswick to withdraw the reading of land acknowledgements by public servants in that province? I love that question. Maurice?
Yeah, I've been asked that at a couple of sessions in the last little while. I just think he's paranoid. That's all. Like the last piece I read said that you know, there's no legality to land acknowledgements. They're not, you know, considered carrying the force of law. It's just, it's to me, that just points out, well, it points out a few things, but it points out the lack of understanding that even people in the highest places in our society, premiers, you know, elected leaders, have no idea about the whole topic. Like, most of you teachers on this call know more about Indigenous issues. However little you think you know, I guarantee you know more than the Premier of New Brunswick right now. He's, you know, it's foolish. You know, and the same thing happened to Montreal Canadiens. I had a land acknowledgement, and because it had said it was the homelands of the Mohawk people, then someone decided, oh no, maybe it was other people. So I don't know whether they withdrew it or changed it, or the whole thing of land acknowledgements is, you know, it's a minefield. And the acid test I apply to things like this is, would you rather they existed or not? Well, I'd rather they existed, but I sure am not going to write them for anybody. And it should be a learning experience for the people who write them. And I guarantee you it's a learning experience for the Premier of Brunswick right now.
Well,
And
I think, oh, go ahead,
I
Natalia.
was just gonna say, I wonder like how much to is his paranoia related to what's going on in the waters and the people, you know, exerting their rights to their fishing. Because it really does, you know, the land acknowledgements, they do make people stop and think about what, you know, what does this mean? Why are we doing this? So it can have, I think, a powerful effect on colonized minds, or to start that, you know, opening those doors. I was going to add, Jody, about some of this teaching that we have to do. I think most important is like teach our kids to be critical thinkers. Right. So I really like what you say about, you know, be the teacher as a learner. So you enter your classroom as a learner with your students. But really, like, we don't have all the answers, and I'm still learning, and I'm almost 50. So it's a long process. But I think if we can be critical, teach them to be critically minded, critical thinkers, then we can help them, lead them to the answers that they seek.
I should add, you know, you people on this session are hearing, you know, I'm sure you've heard before, a lot of negative things that have been done and are being done in Canada with regard to Indigenous peoples. And the good news is we're in a country where that kind of free and open discussion takes place. That's the good news. There's no country in the world, I've traveled a fair bit, there's no country in the world that I would rather live in than Canada. I don't know of Indigenous peoples. We're not separatists like they are in some parts. This is our land, and we want it to be the best it can be for everybody that lives here. And you know, we're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just want the as Senator Murray Sinclair and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, said after their 5 or 6 years, 7 years of deliberation, they're just very specific ways that Canada can be better. And if it's better for Indigenous peoples, it's going to be better for everybody. I guarantee you.
So I'm going to just pop into the chat box a link here, because that something that's been shared out as well in June from our association. So looking at bringing in excellence, brilliance, achievements, things that kids can be inspired by, right? So we talked, it was mentioned, you know, I wanted to mention it at the time, but we moved on. You know, there was mention about the War of 1812. Well, you know, people should be, you know, we're coming up to Remembrance Day. You know, few people know that November 8th is actually Indigenous Veterans Day. So it's an opportunity, again, sort of like Treaty Week. It doesn't mean it's the only time you learn about people, but it's an opportunity to bring it in, to learn about people like Shingwak. I think everyone, these are some things you can look at people as an entry point in without being, I know, because there's a lot of fear around, oh my gosh, I don't know any of this information and I'm just new to learning. While you're doing your learning, you can easily bring in, Tommy Prince or Francis Pegamagabo or, any of these, influencers and incredible people that have changed the shape of society for everyone to have a better experience here, right? And so, that's an opportunity. The resource link that I just shared with you, all kinds, of culinary chefs that are doing some really cool things, artists, it's unlimited when you look at contributions. I would love to see in my school board, every school have images of people past and present, so that when kids, we talk about erasure a lot. So what's the opposite of erasure? Let's bring in the people. We talk about dehumanizing. So let's humanize, the people and the nations, so that there's visibility of, an inspiration. And, the inspiration, not for Indigenous students in your school, but for all students to see the possibilities in those achievements.
2 weeks ago, the Nobel Prize for Medicine went to someone, I think an American, who, quote, discovered, unquote, that common peppers, ingredients in common peppers, the vegetable, had a positive impact on human pain receptors. Indigenous people have been using capsaicin for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The week after that, there was a big news story across my screen about someone inventing for the first time a vaccine against malaria. South American Indigenous peoples in Peru were using quinine, however you pronounce it, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. We didn't get patents on everything. We shared things. We have got patents on all the things that we, quote, discovered, unquote, like medicines, foods, all of the snowshoes, teepees, canoes. We'd be living in high rises, and the settlers would be living on reserves. We shared our knowledge. We shared our gifts with everybody. And I've heard people say things like, well, if you people didn't invent automobiles, well, we didn't want to go anywhere, for one thing. And if we had of, sooner or later we would have.
Yeah, that's the other thing that colonization brought, is the imperialism of knowledge systems, right? So, this is another area that we're trying to do work in through the association as well, is really critically, again, this is why we want to be critical thinkers, is that, look at the messaging. And I mean, the education system is based on the goal of protecting and upholding the goals of colonialism. But think about the messaging that comes through, that, Western science is like the end all and be all. It's like the holy grail of knowledge. That whole idea of white is right, white is best, all of those ideas that continually feed into and through our education system. So we need to, and then there's this devaluing through that process that's been happening, that, relegates down to myths, legends, and lore when it comes to Indigenous knowledge systems, right? It's like, oh, storytelling, cutesy little, or this mystical romanticized versions, which really supports this narrative of Indigenous people being like, just, I don't know, just frolicking in the forest in loincloths. Like that's the narrative that keeps happening. And so we got to look for ways to disrupt that and change that, right? So how do we bring in, if we're going to talk about Indigenous people in the class, make sure we're doing it so that there's an understanding that there are people that come from very different, distinct, diverse nations. There's diversity within the nations, and that the people come from sophisticated societies with complex knowledge systems that are just as valid or on par with quantum physics. It's just that we're still stuck in that colonial narrative in our system, in our school system, right? That we're trying to really break and disrupt. And we can do that by bringing in the contributions of people, right? To give kids a different narrative than what we keep seeing. So see how amazing treaty education can be? Look at the different ways you can get into this conversation. We're coming towards the end of our time. Is there any last burning questions out there? Burning wonderings? Here's your chance. Anybody want to be brave and like put your video on and ask a question? We're really friendly, I swear. Nobody's everybody's like, whoa, that's a lot of information. Oh, okay, I see a hand up here. Laura.
Hi.
Hi, yay, welcome. You
Thank
did it.
you. I have a question in terms of finding out, say, like the details of a treaty on the land that you're on. So for example, I'm in Windsor, Ontario, and I believe that's Treaty 2. And so is there a space that you folks might recommend for like actually looking at the content of that treaty, so that people could really kind of delve into it and find out what that might look like?
Yeah, you should. So I don't know what school board are you with?
The Greater Essex County District School Board.
So Tina DeCastro is the lead there.
Mhm.
She's got heaps of resources and all kinds of, and I know she works with the local communities there. Email her because she would have exactly what you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yay, look, now people are coming forward. Monique.
Ani bonjour, everyone. Just for, I'm the Indigenous lead for Avon Maitland, so I get this question a bit. Boundaries. How do we get away from these are the boundaries? Well, that's a colonial system. We're not really looking at boundaries per se, and even all of the maps that we have are estimates at best. So how do we broach that subject, Maurice?
Mhm.
When I worked at the Union of Ontario Indian, thanks for your question. Thanks so much. When I worked at the Union of Ontario Indians, we developed maps, and there was so much demand for them, they went out of print. I don't know whether they still have them. They might still have them in the treaty kits. Should check with Kelly, Dodie. And our concept was because the Union of Ontario Indians, the Anishinaabe Nation, we represent people in 4 regions of what's called Ontario. And we created this map that showed our regions and, in different colors. And you'd be hard pressed to see any sign that was in Ontario. And it was a new way of, not long after that, the province of Ontario came out with, it's an interesting thing. You probably have it in your schools. It's the map of Ontario showing all of the 134 First Nations on it, but it still shows them as part of Ontario. The map we did showed other communities as part of the Anishinaabe Nation. That hasn't been done very often. I know I've looked, and it would be a good project, actually, if there are teachers out there that want to do that or get their students to create a map that shows, whose territory was whose, before they started turning things over to land surveyors in the 1800s. It'd be an interesting project.
Yeah, and I think even just the discussion around mapping as a tool of colonialism, right? Like mapping has, it's incredible, like how easy it is to simply erase people by maps. And then even the idea of boundaries, like you were saying, like having a conversation around how do you depict boundaries that didn't operate in the same way that we see boundaries today. So, you know, knowing that it was not just these, you know, lines or like a border with border agents, like that's not how things were. And, you know, and then what are the implications for that? And I think maybe, I know I'm always looking for a good product, but sometimes it's not so much about a product or a nice map that just shares it all, but it's the discussion. And it's the inquiry questions that are generated, and it's the wonderings, and it's the rethinking and reimagining of what, you know, it's the conversation. I think that's really where the learning resides in.
Oh, big rich.
There's a good discussion, and mapping is relative to this. There's been a healthy, you know, increasingly more vibrant discussion about the relevance of the national organization that purports to represent First Nations people, the Assembly of First Nations. They have their primary funding comes from the federal government, as does that unfortunately of most Indigenous representative organizations. Their organization was set up so that their regional chiefs, instead of representing nations or territories or treaties, they're lined up with the provinces. Like there's a regional chief for Ontario, a regional chief for Alberta, and that makes no sense at all from an Indigenous perspective. And it's one reason why there's all sorts of internal debates in the organization, and there have been attempts to restructure, but you know, it's just, you know, that's probably a classic example of colonization, of using someone else's boundaries for to define an Indigenous organization. I mean, that's just wrong. So.
Oh, miigwech for your answers.
I was just going to add that if you go back to the original treaties, I think it'd be hard pressed to find a map. So I think that would be a good place to start the discussion about, is there a map here? Was there a description of the boundaries? I know in my own nation, when we signed treaty in 1854, they didn't come for a couple of years to survey the land, and going by some kind of a description that didn't make sense anymore. You know, it created lots of problems, right? And I think that could be the discussion even in terms of mapping.
Yeah, going back to that mapping being problematic.
Absolutely. But how the kids come to that conclusion themselves is way more impactful than us telling them.
Well,
can I ask this wonderful panel of what your interpretation or what your thoughts are on nativeland.ca? Because I know it does show those overlaps. So that is the one thing that I like about it, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I don't know that much about it. Let me just add to something that Natoko said about some of the terms of these strange treaties. My community are Mississauga from Alderville. The Mississaugas were involved in a treaty called the Gunshot Treaty that was supposedly, it involved land. You know, the boundary of the treaty was supposedly as far as you could hear a gunshot.
Right. So what kind of gun, right?
Or
Well,
how good you're hearing.
Yeah.
And where are you standing?
Yeah.
Like, where are you standing when you shoot that gun?
Yeah.
You know?
And whose perspective are you looking at?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah,
the
all
moon's?
kinds. You know what I think with the map though, like with that website it's like, I mean, thank goodness it has a big disclaimer, right? Like right at the beginning that it's ongoing. So like anything, it's not, you don't take it as, you know, it's not black and white. This is the truth and the only truth, right? That I think it's good to show that overlapping idea. I think that, you know, that there's attempts being made to try and resolve the issues that have come forward because of colonial mapping, but be careful, right? To that it doesn't necessarily, because there's still a lot of inaccuracies in it, right? So that, it's like any resource, it's how you use it. And it's funny, you'll find that pretty much any maps when we're talking about treaties all come with a disclaimer, and that should be even a conversation, is why does a map have a disclaimer on it? So
I know the old Ontario treaty map does have a disclaimer on it as well too.
Right.
That's an estimate. Okay, well, why are you estimating?
Yeah. Well, that's the conversation too, right?
Mhm.
I see JR's iPad with your hand up. Are you still there? Oh, did they go? Did you want to ask your question? Whoever JR's iPad is. Okay. Maybe not then. All right. Well, any last words from the people here? Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Is it okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I'm actually from Ottawa, so I'm on unceded, unsurrendered territory. And I feel like that's a whole other layer. And I've done quite a bit of work to prepare a workshop for grade 9s for Monday, or actually the whole week. But I know at the end, they'll be like, but we don't even have a treaty. So is there any comments to that? I know it's so complicated, but these are 14-year-old kids. I'm hoping to shed a bit of light.
Well, the Algonquin Treaty is, is in a work in progress. And they've got a memorandum of understanding, so that's a good discussion in your class. It involves, I can't remember how many square miles, but the terms are have pretty well been decided. I know that Canada's Parliament buildings sit on unceded land.
Yeah.
Yeah, have a conversation about that, right? Like, and then how do the people of the Algonquin people of that territory, don't even have access to their ceremonial grounds that are there. And even I was talking to some friends in Manitoba, and the legislation buildings in Manitoba also are sitting right on top of a very, very sacred ceremonial site. So it's by no accident, right? That this is all
That was intentional.
Yes,
right? That's against the Métis. That's to break their spirit. Absolutely.
Yeah. So having those conversations too is like, again, the violence. It's another form of violence, is putting up these parliament buildings and then, yeah.
Right? It's violence through Christianity, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Lots to unpack there.
Thank you.
So, okay, so I think we are we're just past 5:30.
I was just gonna say, was it Monique, you were asking about the maps?
Yes.
Of land?
Yeah.
If you Google, what's my favorite educator? Jane Elliott, you know her?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, she did a little YouTube video on how the globe is racist.
Yes.
Have you seen? So
I've seen it. Yes, I have.
I would share some of that with teachers, to show
Mhm.
them. Yeah.
Very interesting to see how even Turtle Island was put together.
Absolutely.
Right? The skewed view of Turtle Island. Yes.
And then how that's pushed out in the world, right? Like that. Oh, here, look at the globe. Look at the earth. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the name of that? There's in the chat there.
It's Jane Elliott.
Jane Elliott.
Jane Elliott. She's an
That lady that divides, she's that lady that divides groups into blue eyes and brown eyes.
That's it. Yeah, she's a racism educator.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we're gonna wrap up, and there was a question here in the chat that they're curious about the image behind you, Maurice. Maybe the painting behind you.
My birth father
Can you, Morris, speak on to the other side? When you move to that side, we can't
Okay.
hear you. There you
My-
go. You're back.
Yeah, my birth father was a Jewish cab driver in Toronto. And my mother is where I get my First Nation heritage. My mother, Ruby, and my father, Harold. Interestingly, my Indian grandfather's first name was Moses, and my Jewish grandfather's first name was Harry. So I thought that was interesting. That poster, I bought that in Vancouver because it was an art exhibition that talked about Indigenous and Jewish people similarities. I actually done presentations about that. And so that's what you see, I think, over my shoulders. It's a Jewish elder wearing a shawl. I think that's what you see. So I'm proud of my heritages, both of them. And there are a lot of similarities. It's a small club, but some of our members include people like Robbie Robertson from the band, Fame. He has similar heritage, but I'll tell you, if you come from those two heritages, you learn a lot about the importance of land and the importance of culture and the importance of language and the devastations that can be caused when people don't think you have a right to exist.
So thank you for that. So we do have to wrap up because I'm hosting this meeting and I have night school. So I gotta go. So Tisa, do you want last words from you?
No, I'm just always so enlightened. I'm so enlightened, and I had to step away for a little bit. I had an appointment to get to, but I'm glad I was here for the time that I was here, and in the presence of all of the educators that are coming on their own time, and for Maurice and Jody, Natalka, your wisdom. It's so great. Miigwech.
Natalka, last words?
I want to say miigwech Tisa for reminding me to make sure that treaty education and all of our Indigenous education is done throughout the year. I want to say miigwech to Maurice for sharing your knowledge with us about treaties and reminded me about the Constitution in section 35. Thank Jody for all her hard work and her dedication to our people and sharing our knowledge with Ontario educators. And I just want, this one's for Maurice. I am a second generation card carrying Indian, Canadian, I guess second generation Canadian, but card carrying Indian, meaning I have status. And my father is first generation Canadian. His parents came from World War II. They were in camps, slave labor camps, and so they came to Canada for a better life. And so I'm always reminded about Canada being a great country, and that's why I want to build it to make it a better country for all of our future generations. So miigwech everyone for coming.
And lastly, over to you, Maurice. Final words?
Just miigwech everybody. Thank you for hosting this, Jody and Tisa and Natalka, you know, for joining, and it's just my opening comments really encapsulated the most important work being done in our societies are being done by educators, by teachers. Most influential people in my life, aside from my immediate family, were teachers. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and hope you just have the spirit to continue it. So miigwech.
Well, miigwech everyone, miigwech Kanawea, and have a good rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay well, look after your well-being. It's really important right now, and just grateful for all the work that everybody is doing out there. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.